The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a blade through silk, and I stood on the platform with my suitcase clutched between trembling hands, watching my family board without me. They knew I was there. Mother had glanced back once, just once, her eyes sliding past me as if I were part of the station's architecture, something fixed and forgettable. Father climbed the steps behind her, his hand steady on her lower back, protective in a way it had never been with me. And Lily, my younger sister, bounced up the stairs with her new dress swirling around her knees, the one Mother had bought her yesterday while I'd waited outside the shop because there wasn't enough money for two. The conductor raised his flag. The train lurched forward with a mechanical groan that vibrated through the concrete beneath my feet. I wanted to call out, wanted to run after them, with my arms waving and my voice breaking the way it always did when I begged for their attention. But my throat had closed around the words, sealing them inside where they crystallized into something sharp and permanent. They were going to Aunt Caroline's estate in the countryside for the summer. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, elegant script on cream-coloured paper. The Harrison family is cordially invited. 4 names listed, 4 train tickets purchased. I'd watched Mother count them at the kitchen table, her lips moving silently as she sorted them into neat alignment. "There's only 4 tickets," I'd said, my voice small. "Yes, darling," Mother had replied without looking up. "For your father, myself, Lily, and your brother." "But David isn't coming. He's staying at university for his research position." Mother's hands had stilled for just a moment before continuing their efficient sorting. "Oh, well, the tickets are already bought." I'd waited for her to say something else, to acknowledge what was happening, to tell me it was a mistake or that we'd figure something out. Instead, she tucked the tickets into her leather folio and asked if I'd started on dinner yet because Father would be home soon and he didn't like waiting. Now the train was pulling away, gaining speed, carrying them towards something beautiful and exclusive, while I remained rooted to the platform like a weed that had grown up through the cracks. Other families milled around me, children shrieking with excitement, lovers embracing, businessmen checking their watches with practiced impatience. The world continued its relentless forward motion, while I existed in a pocket of stillness, invisible and increasingly irrelevant. I walked home through streets that shimmered with heat, my suitcase bumping against my leg with each step. I'd packed it so carefully, folding my 3 good dresses with tissue paper between the layers, tucking my journal into the side pocket where it wouldn't get crushed. Stupid. So stupid to have believed that this time might be different. That Mother's casual mention of family vacation might actually include me in any meaningful way. The house was empty when I arrived, stripped of the warm chaos that usually filled it. No Lily practicing piano in the parlour. No Father's pipe smoke drifting from his study. No Mother's perfume lingering in the hallways. Just silence and dust motes spinning through the afternoon light, indifferent to my presence. I set my suitcase by the door and walked through the rooms like a ghost touring her own haunting. In the kitchen, Mother had left a list of instructions, tasks to complete while they were away, things to maintain so the house would be perfect for their return. Polish the silver, wash the curtains, weed the garden, make sure Mrs. Patterson gets her rent payment. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, there's money in the blue tin for groceries. Make it last. I crumpled the list in my fist, then smoothed it out again because destroying it wouldn't change anything. The words would still be true. My role would still be clear. I was the keeper of their comfort, the maintainer of their world, valuable only in my utility. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, the smallest bedroom, the one at the back of the house that never quite got warm in winter, and stared at the ceiling while memories played across it like a magic lantern show. Lily's 8th birthday, when Father had hired a photographer and they'd posed for portraits in the garden, telling me I should stay inside because someone needed to watch the cake. My graduation from secondary school, when Mother had been too tired to attend because she'd been up late helping Lily rehearse for her dance recital. Christmas morning, when I'd received practical gifts, stockings, a warm coat, sensible shoes, while Lily had torn through packages of jewellery and books and delicate things meant to be cherished rather than used. Small moments, individually insignificant. But they'd accumulated over the years like sediment, building up layer by layer until they'd formed the bedrock of my existence. I was the daughter they'd kept because it would have been scandalous not to, but I'd never been the daughter they'd wanted. Around midnight, my chest began to ache. Not the metaphorical ache of a wounded heart. I was long past expecting that to feel like anything but a dull, familiar throb. This was physical, sharp, a tightening sensation that made each breath feel like drawing air through wet fabric. I sat up, pressed my palm against my sternum, tried to breathe deeper. The pain intensified, spreading outward in waves. My left arm tingled. The room tilted sideways, and I had the distant thought that something was very wrong, that I should call for help, that I shouldn't be alone right now. But I was always alone. That was the truth I'd been trying to ignore. I fell back against the pillows as my vision started to blur at the edges. The ceiling receded, growing distant and hazy. My heartbeat stuttered. Quick, quick, quick. Then a long pause that stretched into something that felt like falling. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 1 a.m. The sound reached me as if travelling through water, muffled and strange. I thought about the train pulling away from the station, about Mother's eyes sliding past me, about the suitcase I'd packed so carefully, still sitting by the front door where I'd left it, full of hope that had curdled into something harder. The pain was fading now, or maybe I was just drifting away from it. Either way, the distance was a mercy. My last coherent thought was that at least I wouldn't have to polish the silver. At least I wouldn't have to exist in the negative space of their affection anymore. At least it was over. Then there was nothing but darkness and the sound of my own heartbeat, slowing, slowing, slowing until it stopped. The first thing I noticed was the light, too bright, too sharp, cutting through my closed eyelids with insistent clarity. The second thing was the sound of my mother's voice, high and irritated, calling from downstairs. "Helena, if you're not down here in 5 minutes, we're leaving without you." I opened my eyes. Familiar wallpaper, pale yellow with tiny roses, stretched across the walls of my childhood bedroom. Not the small room at the back of the house, the bigger one, the one I'd had before Lily was born, and they'd needed the space for a proper nursery. I hadn't slept in this room in 12 years. I sat up slowly, my body feeling strange. Light, young. My hands looked wrong, smaller, smoother, the veins less prominent beneath skin that hadn't yet learned to show its age. I touched my face and felt the softness of 17-year-old cheeks, the absence of the fine lines that had started appearing around my eyes. The calendar on the wall showed June 1962. 12 years. I'd gone back 12 years. The memories crashed over me then, not returning gradually, but all at once like a dam breaking, the train station, my family leaving, the empty house, the pain in my chest, the darkness, but beneath those recent memories lay others. This day, this specific day, when everything had started. The day of my uncle's funeral in the city, when Father had said the whole family needed to attend to pay our respects, when we'd all gotten dressed in black and piled into the car. Only we hadn't all attended. Not in that first life. I'd stayed home at the last minute because Lily had complained of a stomachache and someone needed to watch her, and Mother had looked at me with those expectant eyes and said, "You don't mind, do you, darling? You understand how important this is?" And I'd nodded. I'd always nodded. But this time I remembered what came after. I remembered 12 years of being pushed to the margins, of being useful but never valued. I remembered the train station and the suitcase and the way Mother's eyes had slid past me as if I were invisible. I remembered dying, alone. "Helena!" Mother's voice again, sharp now. "Now?" I stood up, my legs steady beneath me, and looked at myself in the mirror. 17 years old, my dark hair still long because I hadn't yet cut it short for practicality, my face unlined by disappointment. But my eyes held something different. Knowledge, clarity, the kind of understanding that comes from watching your own life from the outside and finally seeing it for what it is. I dressed quickly, pulling on my black dress, the one I'd worn to the funeral, the one I'd never gotten to wear in that first timeline, because I'd stayed home with Lily, who'd miraculously recovered by lunchtime, well enough to eat 3 sandwiches and demand that I play cards with her. I walked downstairs where my family waited by the door. Father checking his pocket watch, Mother adjusting her hat, Lily sitting on the bottom step with her hand pressed dramatically to her stomach, her face arranged in an expression of theatrical distress. "Oh, there you are," Mother said, barely glancing at me. "Listen, Lily's not feeling well. You'll need to stay with her." In my first life, I'd felt my heart sink. I'd felt the crushing weight of obligation mixed with the desperate desire to please, to be good, to be the daughter they needed, even if I'd never be the daughter they wanted. I'd opened my mouth to agree, to sacrifice my presence at my uncle's funeral, to spend the day caring for a sister who wasn't actually sick. But that was the old Helena, the one who'd died alone with a chest full of pain and a house full of tasks left undone. "No," I said. The word hung in the air like smoke. Mother's hand stilled on her hat. Father looked up from his watch. Lily's eyes widened, her performance momentarily forgotten. "What?" Mother's voice carried a note of confusion, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "No," I repeated, calmer this time. "I'm coming to the funeral. Lily can stay home by herself for a few hours. She's 14, old enough to manage." "But she's sick," Mother said, her tone shifting toward that familiar disapproval, the one that had always made me crumble. I looked at Lily, really looked at her, saw the flush of health in her cheeks, the alertness in her eyes, the way her hand rested against her stomach without any real indication of discomfort. "She's not sick. She never is when it's something she doesn't want to do." "How dare you?" Mother began. "I'm going," I said, and walked past them to the car. The silence that followed was profound. I could feel their shock radiating behind me like heat. I climbed into the back seat and sat there, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beating fast but steady. Through the window, I watched them have a hurried, hushed conversation. Mother's face was tight with displeasure. Father looked bewildered. Lily had abandoned her sick act entirely and was gesturing wildly, clearly arguing her case. Finally, they came out. But Mother's lips were pressed into a thin line. Father opened the driver's door without looking at me. Lily climbed into the back seat as far from me as possible, her arms crossed and her lower lip pushed out in a pout. We drove to the city in silence. The landscape rolled past the windows, familiar and strange at the same time, younger somehow, like the whole world had been given a fresh coat of paint. Buildings I remembered being torn down in the late 60s still stood proud. Roads that would later be expanded were narrow and manageable. The past was a foreign country, even when you'd lived there before. At the funeral, I stood with my family in the church pew, but I was separate from them in a way I'd never been before. They formed a tight unit. Father's hand on Mother's elbow, Mother's hand on Lily's shoulder. While I stood at the end, alone, but no longer lonely. There was freedom in this distance. Space to breathe. After the service, during the reception at Uncle Thomas's house, I did something I'd never done before. I talked to people. Not as the forgettable Harrison daughter who faded into the background, but as myself. I spoke with Uncle Thomas's business partners about his work. I laughed with distant cousins I'd barely known. I accepted a glass of wine from a waiter and sipped it slowly, feeling sophisticated and separate and entirely my own person. "You seem different," Aunt Caroline said, appearing at my elbow with her usual elegant bearing. She was Mother's older sister, intimidating and perceptive in equal measure. "More present." "I feel different," I said, and it was the truth. "Good." She studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes seeing more than I wanted to reveal. "Your mother tells me you've been quite assertive today." I waited for the criticism, the gentle suggestion that I should be more accommodating, more considerate of my family's needs. "It suits you," Aunt Caroline said instead. "Don't lose it." Over the next weeks, I continued making small changes. When Mother asked me to skip my evening walk so I could help Lily with her homework, I said no and went anyway. When Father expected me to type his correspondence because his secretary was on holiday, I told him I had plans. When they needed someone to host Lily's friends for an afternoon party, I made myself unavailable. Each refusal felt like shedding a layer of skin that had never quite fit. Each boundary I set was a declaration of my own existence. They didn't like it. Mother's disapproval manifested in cold silences and pointed comments. Father retreated into his study, confused by this daughter, who no longer bent to accommodate his convenience. Lily oscillated between rage and bewilderment, unable to understand why her built-in servant had suddenly declared independence. But I remembered the train station. I remembered dying alone. And I knew with crystalline certainty that their disapproval was a small price to pay for my self-respect. In my first life, I'd spent that summer at home, washing windows and tending the garden, while my family, minus David, who was genuinely busy at university, went to Aunt Caroline's estate. I'd received one postcard in 3 months, a generic scenic view with "having a lovely time" scrawled on the back in Mother's neat handwriting. But this time, when the invitation arrived and Mother started talking about the trip, I was ready. "The tickets are expensive this year," Mother said at dinner one evening, her tone casual but pointed. "We'll have to be selective about who goes." I looked up from my plate, meeting her eyes directly. "I'd like to go." The surprise on her face was almost comical. "Well, we'll have to see. Money is tight." "I have some saved," I said. It was true. I'd been secretly setting aside the small amounts I earned from mending neighbours' clothes, something I'd started doing for pin money. "I can buy my own ticket?" "That's not necessary," Father said, but his tone was uncertain, as if he was trying to remember the rules of a game that had suddenly changed. "I think it is," I replied calmly. "I'd like to come, and I don't want to be a burden on the family budget." Over the next 2 weeks, they tried various strategies to dissuade me. Mother mentioned how much work there was at Aunt Caroline's, how I'd probably be bored, how the countryside wasn't really my style. Father suggested I might prefer to stay home, where I'd have the house to myself, framing it as a privilege rather than an exclusion. Lily simply ignored me, as if refusing to acknowledge my presence might make me disappear. But I'd already died once from being invisible. I wasn't about to do it again. The day before they were planning to leave, I went to the train station by myself. The same platform where I'd watched them abandon me in my first life. The same ticket window where destiny had been determined by their choices rather than mine. "1 ticket to Millbrook," I told the attendant. "Departing June 23rd, returning September the 5th. He counted out my money, bills and coins I'd earned with my own hands, saved in a tin box under my bed. The ticket he handed me was identical to the ones my family had purchased, but it felt entirely different. It was mine, bought with my own money, representing my own choice, taking me toward a future I was determining for myself. That night at dinner, I placed the ticket on the table beside my plate. Mother stared at it as if I'd set down a live snake. "What is that?" "My ticket," I said, "for tomorrow's train to Aunt Caroline's." You can't be serious, Mother said, her voice climbing toward a shrill. I'm completely serious. But the house? Will be fine, empty for a summer, or you can arrange for Mrs. Patterson to check on it. That's what people normally do when they travel. Helena, Father said, his tone attempting authority, but landing somewhere closer to pleading. Your mother and I need you to understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted, something I'd never done before. I understand that you've spent my entire life treating me like a convenience rather than a daughter. I understand that you would have left me behind tomorrow without a second thought. But I've bought my own ticket, and I'm coming. Unless you plan to physically prevent me from boarding the train, I'll see you at the station at 9 o'clock. Lily made a small sound, shock or distress, I couldn't tell which. Mother's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish drowning in air. This is unacceptable, Mother finally said, her voice trembling. Ungrateful, selfish, unacceptable. I felt the old impulse rise up, apologise, retreat, make myself small and accommodating and easy to overlook. But I pushed it down and met her eyes with steady calm. You're right, I said. I have been ungrateful. I should have valued myself more all along, rather than being grateful for whatever scraps of attention you threw my way. I stood up, leaving my dinner half finished, and walked upstairs to pack my suitcase. The same suitcase from my first life, but this time I packed it with defiance instead of hope, with certainty instead of desperate longing. The next morning, I was ready before anyone else. I stood by the door with my suitcase and my ticket, wearing my travelling suit and my mother's pearls, taken from her jewellery box without asking, because I'd finally understood that I'd been asking permission for things that should have been freely given my entire life. When they came downstairs, dressed and ready for departure, they found me waiting. You're really doing this, Mother said. It wasn't a question. Yes. We drove to the station in even heavier silence than before. When we arrived, I got out of the car and retrieved my suitcase from the trunk before anyone could offer to help. Not that they were going to. I walked to the platform alone, bought a newspaper and a cup of coffee from the vendor, and sat on a bench to wait for the train. My family clustered together, about 20 feet away, a tight knot of whispered conversations and furtive glances in my direction. I ignored them. I read my newspaper and sipped my coffee and felt the summer sun on my shoulders, warm and bright and entirely indifferent to family drama. When the train arrived, I boarded first. I found my seat in a different car from where they were sitting, by the window, in a row to myself. As the train began to move, I looked out at the platform disappearing behind us, and felt something inside me click into place. The final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. I had belonged to myself all along. I'd just been waiting for permission to realise it. The journey to Millbrook took 6 hours. I spent them reading and watching the landscape transform from city to suburbs to open countryside, each mile taking me further from the life I'd left behind and closer to the person I was becoming. At Aunt Caroline's estate, things were different from the start. I carried my own luggage up the front steps. I greeted my aunt with genuine warmth rather than shy deference. When she asked about my summer plans, I told her about the books I wanted to read, the sketching I wanted to do, the long walks I intended to take through her woods. You're welcome to use the studio, she said, surprising me. In the East Wing, I used to paint there, but my hands aren't what they used to be. It has wonderful light. Thank you, I said, meaning it. I'd like that. Over the next weeks, I established a routine that revolved around myself rather than others' needs. I woke early and took my coffee in the garden, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. I spent mornings in the studio, rediscovering a love of drawing I'd abandoned when it became clear it was taking time away from more useful pursuits. I read in the afternoons, curled up in a leather armchair in Aunt Caroline's library, losing myself in novels and poetry and memoirs of women who'd claimed their own lives. My family moved through the estate like ghosts that couldn't quite believe I wasn't attending to their haunting. Mother kept expecting me to appear at her elbow, ready to help with her correspondence or accompany Lily on shopping trips to the village. Father seemed perpetually confused by my absence at mealtimes, as if he'd forgotten I existed unless I was serving some function. Lily sulked for the first 2 weeks, before apparently deciding I'd been replaced in her affections by a group of local girls she'd befriended. I didn't care. Or rather, I cared less and less each day, like the tide pulling back to reveal the solid ground that had been there all along beneath the water. Aunt Caroline noticed, of course. She had a way of appearing in doorways when you least expected it, her presence announced by the soft tap of her walking stick on hardwood floors. "You've changed," she said one afternoon, finding me in the studio where I was sketching the view from the window. "Your mother complains about it constantly." "I'm sure she does," I said, not looking up from my work. "She says you've become selfish and difficult." "I've become selective about how I spend my time and energy. If that's selfish, then yes, I suppose I have." Aunt Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she walked further into the room, examining the sketches pinned to the walls, landscapes and portraits and studies of light and shadow. "These are good," she said. "Really good. Have you considered applying to art school?" I'd never considered it because it had never been presented as an option. Education was for David, who would need it for his career. Lily would eventually marry well and wouldn't need more than finishing school. And I had been expected to make myself useful until some man decided I was useful enough to marry, at which point I'd make myself useful to him instead. I hadn't thought about it, I admitted. "Think about it now," Aunt Caroline said. "I know the director at the Ashworth Institute in the city. I could write you a recommendation." She left me there with that possibility hanging in the air like incense, filling the room with its potential. Art school. A life of my own choosing. A future that wasn't defined by my utility to others, but by my own desires and talents. The summer unfolded in long, golden days that felt like a rebirth in miniature. I grew stronger, not just emotionally, but physically. From the walking and the independence, and the simple act of taking up space without apologizing for it. My hair grew longer. My skin took on colour from the sun. My hands grew confident, moving across paper with increasing surety. And my family struggled. I watched it happen with a kind of detached fascination. Without me to smooth over rough edges and anticipate needs and make myself useful, they discovered they didn't actually function as well as they'd believed. Mother grew increasingly irritable, snapping at father over minor inconveniences. Father retreated further into his newspapers and pipes, avoiding conflict by avoiding presence. Lily, deprived of her built-in companion and servant, bounced between various social groups without ever quite fitting in anywhere. They'd used me as the glue that held them together, and in my absence, the cracks were showing. One evening in late July, Mother found me reading in the garden as the sun set. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down on the bench beside me without invitation. I marked my page and set the book aside. "All right. This behaviour of yours, this rebellion, or whatever you want to call it, it needs to stop. You're embarrassing the family." "How am I embarrassing you?" "By being so separate, so independent. People are asking questions. Aunt Caroline mentioned your art school ambitions to some of her friends, and now everyone's talking about how odd it is that we didn't encourage you before." I felt a smile tug at my lips, not cruel, just amused. "Is that what bothers you? Not that you didn't encourage me, but that people know you didn't?" Mother's face tightened. "You're twisting my words." "I don't think I am. I think you're upset because my independence reflects poorly on you, not because you genuinely care about my happiness or fulfillment." "How can you say such things? After everything we've done for you, what have you done for me?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Specifically, I'd like to know. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for examples. I could see her mentally cataloguing the years, the roof over my head, the food on the table, the clothes on my back. Basic necessities that any parent provides. But love? Attention? Investment in my interests and dreams? Those things had always been in short supply, rationed out, like precious resources that were better spent elsewhere. I gave birth to you, she finally said, as if that alone should guarantee my eternal gratitude and submission. You did, I agreed, and I'm grateful to be alive. But that doesn't mean I owe you my entire existence. That doesn't mean I have to shrink myself to make room for everyone else. That doesn't mean I have to die a little bit every day just to make your lives easier. Die? Mother laughed, sharp and bitter. So dramatic. No one asked you to die. But they had. They'd asked me to die 1,000 small deaths. To kill my interests, my desires, my sense of self-worth. To be invisible when convenient and useful when necessary. To exist in the negative space of their affection. I'd done it once. I wouldn't do it again. I'm going to art school, I said. Aunt Caroline is writing my recommendation, and I've already started on my portfolio. I'll stay at home until I leave for university, but things are going to be different. I'm not your built-in help anymore. I'm not Lily's substitute mother. I'm not father's secretary. I'm your daughter, and if you can't treat me like one, then we'll simply be housemates until I leave. Mother stood up abruptly, her hand shaking. You'll regret this selfishness, this ingratitude. It will come back to haunt you. Maybe, I said, picking up my book again. But I already know what regret feels like. I lived with it for years, regretting every time I said yes when I should have said no, every time I made myself small to make you comfortable. I'd rather regret standing up for myself than regret lying down for you. She left without another word, her footsteps sharp against the stone path. I stayed in the garden until the stars came out, feeling lighter than I had in both lifetimes. The summer ended, as all summers do, inevitably, but somehow still surprising in its finality. On our last day at the estate, I walked through Aunt Caroline's woods one final time, saying goodbye to the trees and streams and hidden clearings that had witnessed my transformation. The girl who'd arrived here in June was not the same person leaving in September. She'd shed her old skin like a snake, leaving it behind on the forest floor to decompose into something that might nourish new growth. At the train station in Millbrook, my family boarded the train back to the city. This time, I boarded with them, but I sat in my own seat, in my own car, my suitcase filled with sketches and finished paintings and the acceptance letter from Ashworth Institute that had arrived the week before. I was going to art school in January. I was going to study under masters and develop my craft and build a life that belonged entirely to me. The train pulled away from the station, and I watched the countryside blur past the window, feeling the rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks like a heartbeat, steady, reliable, moving forward. When we arrived in the city, I took a taxi home instead of riding in the family car. It was an unnecessary expense, a small luxury I couldn't quite afford, but I wanted to arrive on my own terms in my own time. The house looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier around the edges. Funny how leaving changed your perspective on the place you'd left. Inside, Mother had already begun reorganising, putting things back in their proper places, which really meant putting me back in mine. She'd left a list of chores on the kitchen table, longer than the one from last summer, as if she could paper over my defiance with an overwhelming quantity of expectations. I read through the list once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where we kept old correspondence and forgotten obligations. Then I went upstairs to my room, still the small one at the back because Lily's room was Lily's room and always would be, and began planning my future. Art school in January, a tiny apartment near campus that Aunt Caroline had helped me find. part-time work at a gallery where I could learn the business side of art while developing my own practice. A life that was mine, shaped by my choices, defined by my desires. The weeks until my departure passed in a strange limbo. I was still living at home, but no longer of it, like a ghost haunting a house I'd once inhabited. Mother and I barely spoke. Father retreated further into his study, as if uncomfortable with the idea of a daughter he couldn't categorize or control. Lily oscillated between ignoring me and launching small verbal attacks designed to wound, though they glanced off me now like arrows bouncing off armor. I spent my time preparing, gathering supplies, reading ahead in my course materials, sketching constantly. My hands were developing calluses from the pencils and charcoal, physical proof of my dedication to this new path. On my last night in the house, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed and thought about both my lives. The first one that had ended in quiet desperation. The second one that was still unfolding like a flower opening to the sun. I thought about the train station where I'd been left behind, and the train ticket I'd bought for myself, and the difference between being chosen and choosing yourself. In the morning, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a trunk. Everything I owned fit into 3 containers, a testament to how little I'd accumulated in a life spent being useful rather than being myself. Father drove me to my new apartment because Mother had developed a convenient headache and Lily had school. We didn't speak during the drive. When we arrived, he helped me carry my things up the 3 flights of stairs to my tiny studio, then stood awkwardly in the doorway as if unsure what to say now that our roles had been permanently redefined. "Your mother," he began, then trailed off. "I know," I said, not unkindly, "but this is what I need to do." He nodded slowly, pulled out his wallet, and handed me some bills for emergencies or whatever you need. It was the closest he'd ever come to approval, and I found myself unexpectedly moved. "Thank you." After he left, I stood in my empty apartment and felt the weight of possibility settle over me like a cloak. This space was mine. This life was mine. Every choice from here forward would be mine. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, placing each item with care. Books on the shelf, clothes in the small closet, art supplies on the table by the window where the light was best. Each object was a declaration, a small act of claiming space in the world. That night, I ate dinner alone at the small table I'd bought secondhand. Just bread and cheese and fruit, simple but sufficient. Through the window, I could see the lights of the city stretching out in all directions, full of people living their own lives, making their own choices, stumbling and succeeding and trying again. I was one of them now. Not special, not chosen, but choosing myself, and that made all the difference. Art school was harder than I'd imagined and better than I dreamed. My professors were demanding, my classmates were talented, and I struggled constantly with the gap between my vision and my ability. But struggle, I discovered, was different from suffering. Struggle meant growth. Suffering meant stagnation. I threw myself into my work with an intensity that surprised even me. I spent long hours in the studio, my hands cramped from holding brushes, my eyes burning from studying colour and form and light. I made terrible paintings and decent ones, and occasionally something that approached good. I learned to accept criticism without crumbling, to see failure as information rather than judgment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I got better. By the end of my first semester, I'd sold my first painting, a small landscape of Aunt Caroline's woods at sunset, purchased by a woman who said it reminded her of peace she'd lost and was learning to find again. The money was modest, but it felt like a fortune. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. Someone had valued my work enough to exchange their resources for it. I was becoming something I'd never dared imagine in my first life. An artist, yes, but more than that, a person with value that existed independent of my usefulness to others. My family and I maintained a careful distance. I visited occasionally, usually for major holidays, and the visits were civil but strained. Mother never asked about my art. Father made awkward attempts at conversation about weather and politics. Lily had moved into my old role, though she performed it with visible resentment, as if she'd been cheated of something that should have been hers by right of being the preferred daughter. During one Christmas visit, I overheard Mother talking to Aunt Caroline in the parlour. "I don't understand her," Mother was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "She was such a sweet, accommodating child. Now she's so hard." "She's not hard," Aunt Caroline replied. "She's strong. There's a difference. She barely speaks to me anymore." "Perhaps because you never really spoke to her before. You spoke at her, around her, but never to her as a person with her own thoughts and feelings." There was a long silence. Then Mother said, very quietly, "It's too late now, isn't it?" "I don't know," Aunt Caroline said. "That's up to both of you." But it wasn't too late because there had never been a real beginning. You can't lose something you never truly had. Years passed. I graduated from Ashworth and began building a career, teaching part-time while developing my own work. I had my first gallery show, modest but well-reviewed. I rented a better apartment, one with huge windows and enough space for a proper studio. I dated occasionally, though I was careful now about who I let close, having learned that intimacy required vulnerability and vulnerability required trust. I built a life that was entirely my own, and my family lived with the consequences of their choices. I heard things through the family network, Aunt Caroline mostly, who maintained relationships with everyone and therefore knew everyone's business. Lily had married young to a man who seemed charming until the wedding, after which his charm curdled into control. She was unhappy but trapped, having never developed any independence or skills beyond being pretty and agreeable. Mother and father's marriage had grown brittle, held together by habit rather than affection, both of them seemingly confused about how they'd ended up so isolated. They'd built a family system that required my sacrifice to function, and, in my absence, it had collapsed like a house of cards. I didn't take pleasure in their unhappiness. I'd moved past the need for their suffering to validate my pain. But I didn't feel guilty about it either. They'd made their choices. I'd made mine. We were all living with the results. On the 5th anniversary of my rebirth, though I was the only one who knew to mark it, I returned to that train station. The same platform where I'd watched them leave me behind, where I'd felt the crushing weight of my own invisibility. I stood there as the afternoon sun slanted across the concrete and watched families boarding trains, couples embracing, businessmen rushing past with briefcases and urgent appointments. The world continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to individual heartbreak or triumph. But I was different. I'd bought my own ticket. I'd chosen my own destination. And I'd never looked back. The whistle blew. A train pulled away from the platform, carrying people toward their futures, chosen or unchosen, aware or unaware, free or bound. I watched it disappear around the bend, then turned and walked back into the city, into my life, into the future I was still creating, one choice at a time. The old Helena had died at that train station, invisible and alone. The new Helena had been born there too, reborn in defiance and self-determination. I'd left them behind at the train station, and in doing so, I'd found myself. The rhythm of my footsteps on the platform matched the rhythm of my heartbeat, steady, strong, entirely my own, and that, I thought, was the only justice I'd ever needed. Not revenge, not their regret, just the quiet certainty that I belonged to myself, that I'd claimed my own life, that I'd chosen my own worth. They would live with what they'd lost. They would wonder, perhaps, in quiet moments, what I might have been to them if they'd ever truly seen me. They would remember the train station, and the daughter who'd simply refused to be left behind this time, who'd bought her own ticket and never looked back. And I would live with what I'd gained. Not their love, I'd stopped waiting for that long ago, but something better, my own. The train station faded behind me as I walked toward the city, toward my studio, toward the canvas waiting for me with its promise of creation and possibility, toward the life I'd built from the ashes of the one they tried to keep me in. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the same colours I'd learned to capture in my paintings, the same colours that had greeted me every morning at Aunt Caroline's estate when I'd first learned what it meant to belong to myself. I smiled, not from happiness exactly, but from peace, the deep, unshakable peace of knowing that whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The old life was gone, the new life was mine, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.